What happens to your brain when you do nothing? When you sit in silence, without music, without notifications, without conversation, just you and the quiet. For most of us, silence feels uncomfortable. We reach for our phones, we turn on the TV, we fill the air with sound. But here's the twist. Modern neuroscience has discovered that silence is not empty. It's full. It's active. It's transformative. In 2013, a study published in Brain Structure and Function revealed something astonishing. 2 hours of silence a day stimulated the growth of new brain cells in the hippocampus, the region responsible for memory and learning. Think about that. Silence doesn't just calm you down, it literally grows your brain. And yet, this is not news to everyone. Long before MRI scans and laboratory experiments, monks across cultures, Christian, Buddhist, Sufi, Hindu, were practicing silence as a discipline. They believed it purified the soul, sharpened the mind, and opened the heart. So the question is, how did they know? How did ancient monks, without neuroscience, understand that silence was medicine for the mind? And what can we learn from them today, in a world addicted to noise? This is the story of silence. A story where ancient wisdom and modern science meet. Ancient monks and the discipline of silence. Let's step back in time. Imagine a Benedictine monastery in the Middle Ages. Stone walls, flickering candles, the faint sound of footsteps on cold floors. And silence. Not just the absence of noise, but a chosen discipline. Saint Benedict, the father of Western monasticism, wrote in his rule, "Listen carefully, my child, to the master's instructions, and attend to them with the ear of your heart." For Benedict, silence was not emptiness, it was listening. Listening to God, to conscience, to the inner voice that gets drowned out by chatter. In the deserts of Egypt, the Desert Fathers practiced solitude and silence as a way to strip life down to its essentials. They believed that in silence, the illusions of the world fell away, and the truth of the soul was revealed. In Buddhist monasteries, silence was equally central. Monks would retreat into caves or forests, practicing meditation for hours, days, even years. The Buddha himself taught that liberation comes not through endless debate, but through stillness of mind. And in Sufi traditions, silence was seen as a doorway to the divine. The poet Rumi wrote, "Silence is the language of God, all else is poor translation." Across cultures, silence was never just the absence of sound. It was a tool, a practice, a way of reshaping the mind. Now let's connect this to modern psychology. Today, we know that silence reduces cortisol, the stress hormone. It lowers blood pressure. It improves focus. In other words, what monks practiced for the soul, science now confirms for the brain. But here's the fascinating part. Monks didn't just stumble into silence. They treated it like training. Just as athletes train their bodies, monks trained their minds through silence. And this training left marks, not just on their character, but, as we now know, on their neural pathways. So when we read the journals of monks, or the sayings of the Desert Fathers, we're not just reading theology. We're reading early neuroscience, written in the language of spirituality. And this brings us to the next question. What exactly does silence do to the brain? How does it rewire us? For that, we need to turn to neuroscience. The neuroscience of silence. So what exactly happens in the brain when we embrace silence? For decades, scientists assumed that the brain was like a machine. Once fully developed, its wiring was fixed. But research in the late 20th century shattered that belief. The brain is plastic, it can change, adapt, and grow. And silence, surprisingly, is one of the catalysts. In 2013, neuroscientist Imke Kirst and her team conducted an experiment with mice. They exposed them to different sounds, including music, white noise, and silence. The result? Only silence led to the growth of new neurons in the hippocampus. This is the part of the brain tied to memory, learning, and emotional regulation. In other words, silence literally grows the brain. But that's not all. Studies at Harvard by Sarah Lazar showed that mindfulness practices, often rooted in silence, thicken the prefrontal cortex, the region responsible for decision-making and self-control. At the same time, they shrink the amygdala, the brain's fear center. The result is a calmer, more resilient mind. Silence also activates what neuroscientists call the default mode network. This is the brain's background system, the one that lights up when we're not focused on external tasks. It's in this state that we daydream, reflect, and make sense of our lives. In silence, the brain is not idle. It's integrating, connecting, and creating. Think of silence as a reset button. Just as a computer needs to reboot to clear its memory and run smoothly, the brain needs silence to process, to heal, to rewire. And here's the fascinating part. Silence doesn't just change the brain in the lab. It changes lives. People who practice silence through meditation, prayer, or simply unplugging report lower stress, greater clarity, and deeper creativity. Writers, artists, and thinkers throughout history have sought solitude not as an escape, but as a source of insight. So when monks retreated into silence, they weren't just practicing spirituality. They were engaging in a form of neuroplastic training. They were sculpting their brains long before science could prove it. Now let's bring this closer to home. We live in a world of constant noise. Notifications ping, traffic roars, conversations overlap. Even when we're alone, we fill the silence with podcasts, playlists, or background TV. Silence has become rare, almost uncomfortable. But what if silence is exactly what we need? Modern psychology suggests that even 10 minutes of silence a day can reduce stress and improve focus. 10 minutes. That's less time than most of us spend scrolling through social media. So how do we reclaim silence? It doesn't have to mean moving to a monastery or meditating for hours. It can be as simple as turning off your phone for a short walk, sitting quietly with a notebook, drinking your morning coffee without distractions. The key is intentionality. Silence is not just the absence of sound, it's the presence of awareness. It's choosing to step away from the noise so the mind can breathe. And here's the paradox. Silence is not empty. It's full of thoughts we've been avoiding, emotions we've been suppressing, insights waiting to emerge. That's why it can feel uncomfortable at first. But if we stay with it, silence becomes a teacher. Ancient monks knew this. They treated silence as a discipline, a daily practice. And science now confirms what they intuited. Silence heals, silence rewires, silence transforms. So perhaps the question is not whether we can live with silence, but whether we can live without it. We began with a simple question. What happens to the brain when we do nothing? And we discovered that silence is not emptiness. It is activity, growth, and transformation. Neuroscience shows us that silence stimulates neurogenesis, strengthens the prefrontal cortex, calms the amygdala, and activates the default mode network. In short, silence rewires the brain. But long before science, monks already knew this. They practiced silence not as an escape, but as a discipline. For the Benedictines, silence was listening with the ear of the heart. For the Buddhists, silence was the path to liberation. For the Sufis, silence was the language of God. Across traditions, silence was never passive. It was active, intentional, and transformative. And here we are, in the 21st century, rediscovering what they knew. In a world of constant noise, silence has become rare. But perhaps that makes it even more valuable. 10 minutes of silence a day can lower stress, improve focus, and open space for creativity. 2 hours of silence can literally grow new brain cells. So the question is not whether silence works. The question is whether we are willing to embrace it. Whether we can put down the phone, turn off the background noise, and sit with ourselves. Whether we can face the discomfort of quiet long enough to discover its gifts. Because silence is not just the absence of sound. It is the presence of awareness. It is the soil in which thoughts take root, the canvas on which insights appear, the medicine that heals the modern mind. The monks were right. Silence changes us. And now science proves it. So maybe the challenge for us today is simple, to rediscover silence. To treat it not as a void to be filled, but as a practice to be cultivated. To remember that in the quiet, the brain grows, the mind clears, and the soul listens. In a world addicted to noise, silence is the oldest medicine. And it is waiting for us, if only we are willing to listen.